Okay, so let's continue talking about resources from the sea. In the first one, we're talking about the major things we use the sea for, and we started talking about the food aspect, the major fishing that's done in the food species. And that's where we left off on the previous lecture. We're getting into major food species, things like cod, haddock, hakes, pollocks, whiting, jacks, mullets, the list goes on and on. The big challenge here is a lot of times we may not realize what we're eating when we get seafood. Sometimes it is sold as it was meant to be. In a sense, you buy a tuna steak, you know you're eating tuna. But a lot of times, many of these marine fish are labeled as something differently when they're sold. So they're reprocessed, they're changed, they're modified, or they're just relabeled and called something different. So, I'm getting whitefish. What is whitefish? Which of these species is considered a whitefish? Depends on the restaurant, depends on the distributor, depends on a lot of things. So that makes it a challenge when we're trying to think about eating sustainably. When we go, I'm going to go out for fish dinner, what species am I eating? Do you really know? Does the restaurant really know? I went out to dinner, asked about their seafood. They had fish. They had a fish special. I said, what is it? They didn't know. They said, they gave me the name, and I said, what exactly is that? And the servers didn't know. I said, let me go ask the chef. And they just came back and said, he said it's this fish. I said, where's it from? What type of fish is it? What do you know about it? And they didn't know a lot. And it's not a criticism to the wait staff or the chef, but that's often a challenge. Do we really know what we're eating when we eat something? So we'll get into that. I'll show you a card. I have a picture of a resource card where if you want to try to make better decisions about eating marine species, eating sustainably raised or sustainably harvested marine species, there will be a card in a later lecture here that you guys can print off, or you can go online and print off an updated version because it does change sometimes. So, all right, other major food species. We talk about the fish. That is, again, the big bulk of what we eat from the sea. But mollusks, this is the second most valuable marine group. Okay, we spend a lot of money on mollusks. Now, when we talk about mollusks, again, think global. Squids, octopus, things like cuttlefish. These are all marine mollusks that are harvested globally. We tend not to eat a lot of those in this country, but if anybody has had calamari, you've eaten squid. That's how it's sold. Instead of calling it squid, because we sometimes get a little apprehensive about that, we sell it as calamari. Very good. It's another marine species, another food species. But then we get into things like clams, oysters, mussels, and scallops. All really good marine species, consumable. How do you eat them? Just depends on your personal preference. Now, something I will advise you guys, if you go to a restaurant and get scallops, is it really a scallop? Scallop as in the mollusk, came out of a shell, a hinged shell, what we call a bivalve. Because sometimes what is sold as scallops are stingrays. So they catch a stingray, take those big fins of the stingray, which is mussel with a lot of cartilage in there, and they take what looks like a cookie cutter, a circular cookie cutter, and they punch holes in the stingray fin and market that as scallops. So you have to be aware. So if you get scallops, take a look at it. If it's almost perfectly shaped circle, that's probably not a real mollusk. But these are major food species. The other group we want to talk about are the crustaceans. Now, crustaceans. This is one of the most highly prized groups globally. So think about shrimp. How many shrimp are harvested and consumed in a year. And they often demand huge prices. Lobster, I mean, geesh, lobster tail, sometimes $25, $30, $40 a pound, depending upon the type of lobster and the season, where it came from, etc. Crabs as well. So crustaceans are very highly prized marine species globally. So, we got big groups there: fish, mollusks, crustaceans. There are also a handful of other harvested marine life. Seaweeds. We use that in a lot of different products. We harvest seaweed and use it in many, many different foods. The Dairy Queen ice cream, that thickening agent, often comes from seaweed. Chocolate milk, that thickening agent, often comes from seaweed. There are lots of Asian cultures that consume jellyfish. They take out the little stinging cells so they don't get bit or get stung, but they consume jellyfish. Sea urchins. Cut them open, take the eggs, they call it roe, consume that. Unfortunately, sea turtles and their eggs are often harvested in different cultures and different environments where people eat sea turtles. Seals and whales as well. Different cultures, different perspectives. Seals, whales, they're a source of meat. They're a source of protein. We get into northern environments, Arctic environments. Seals and whales are a big source of protein for many of those cultures. So again, we have to look at the ocean as a whole, not, well, what do we do in central Illinois, or what do we do in New York, or this part of the U.S.? We have to consider the ocean as a whole. It is all connected. So when we're harvesting from one part of the ocean, it does impact the rest of the ocean ecosystem, because everything connects, especially when we talk about the marine system. Now, the concern is trying to maintain an optimal yield and avoid overfishing. So marine species can be considered, or are considered, a renewable resource. Okay, let me change that. If managed correctly, these things can be around forever to provide us with a resource if it's done correctly. But it's got to be done in a sustainable fashion. That is the key. Is it being done sustainably? So two things we have to look at and consider when we're looking at marine fishing, marine fisheries, how can we keep them going on and on and on, is it done, and are we harvesting what's considered a sustainable yield? Okay, what can you take without causing the overall population to go down? That's sustainable yield. And what is the maximum sustainable yield that the fisheries can be put under and keeping it sustainable? That's the key. You can't take more than what can be reproduced in a certain amount of time. So put it into a bank account perspective. I'm putting in $100 every week. If I'm taking out $100, I am being sustainable. Ideally, I would want to only take out 90, because then I leave some in the bank account grows, there's always a little bit of surplus, but sometimes we can't leave a little bit behind. But you have to know what is sustainable. What is your maximum sustainable yield or harvest? So if my bank account, I put in 100 and I'm taking out 120, I'm not sustainable at all. I'm depleting the resource, and eventually that's going to cause a crash. That's the concern. So it's a huge challenge here to figure out what is the sustainable yield of a population, of a particular fishing industry, and how do we regulate that when it is a global resource. If we can produce or create laws or put restrictions on what we do in this country, but if other countries don't follow, or they have restrictions and we don't follow, then it creates a very difficult dynamic. Okay, so the goal here is to figure out when we're looking at sustainable catch, how much can you use, how much can you catch, what is the range of optimal effort? So that's this arc in the center here, where it's showing right here. Okay, range of optimal effort. How many days you go out fishing, how many boats are out on the water, how many people are employed, how much are they catching. There's an optimal effort here. Don't put as many boats in the water and you're underutilizing your resource. Not that that's a bad thing. Your population tends to grow, but your underutilization there, oh, well, you're leaving resources behind that could be used or could be consumed. This tends to cause your population to grow, and your population gets larger if you underutilize. Not always a bad thing, but with human population increasing, we are not able to underutilize that resource typically. So the problem is if we come to this side of the spectrum and we get into overfishing, oh wow, we're putting more boats on the water, more people are fishing, they're catching more than what should be done. Their actual return on energy investment, time spent, labor costs, decreases when you overfish. Then your population size starts to drop. It goes down. It gets smaller and smaller. That becomes a problem because now you're moving away from being sustainable. You start exceeding your maximum sustainable yield. Now, right now, here's a big, horrible, scary, frustrating number. Right now, we're estimating that it's about 70% of marine fish are overfished. 70% are overfished and overharvested. That's way beyond sustainable, way past sustainable yield. So a lot of the fish, these species of tuna and sharks and etc., these big fish, swordfish, etc., the ones they're catching are maybe half the size of what they caught 20 years ago. So there's fewer big fish out there. There's fewer fish in general, but there's fewer and fewer big fish, meaning they're not as mature, they're not as big, they're not as reproductively capable, and we're taking them out of the population before they can really have a good opportunity to reproduce. So it's not a good scenario. I mean, like I said, we're way overfishing a lot of different fisheries and exceeding the maximum sustainable yield. Sword fishery industry fell 70% between the 60s and the 90s. Excuse me. So in the 90s, sword fishing was depleted. You're crashing. It's disappearing. So there's a big campaign that was launched in the 90s and early 2000s to say, let's reduce the consumption of these fish. So that took consumption pressure off of it. So there was less incentive to go out and catch them, which was good, but then people shifted their focus to other fish. Well, we're not going to eat swordfish, let's eat something else. All right, so they redirected their focus. Swordfish industry has started to build up a bit. It takes a long time, though, because of the reproductive potential of many of these big fish. Big fish tend to have very few offspring. They take years and years and years to become reproductively able. It's not like minnows or guppies where you could reproduce hundreds within a course of a couple months. It takes years, decades and decades for these things to recover and to potentially get back to where they used to be. So that is one challenge, huge challenge that is facing marine fisheries or marine species, is exceeding the maximum sustainable yield. Another major issue, or other dangers of fisheries, is habitat destruction. Okay, so think about all the things we do as humans as we alter, change, and destroy habitat, whether it's the mangroves in the tropics, it's the coastal salt marshes in the Gulf of Mexico down by New Orleans, it's the Atlantic East Coast, Eastern Seaboard, etc. These are all areas that have been damaged. And our methods of fishing, let me just put that there. The methods of fishing also cause some major problems. So we'll talk about that later.